like I'm looking at the election. Looks like I'm looking at the election results when South Africa was voting. The tally is not moving, still sitting at number 15. So I guess probably let's start. The recording has just started and the recording will be shared afterwards to all those who have accepted.
Sorry, Chair, just a point is that the Zoom registration, it might take some people time just to join in, but I think we'll just let them trickle in.
All right. Thank you. As we've said, we are looking at what happened at the World Circular Economy Forum this year from the African perspective. These are the topics that we will be looking at. Thank you very much to our speakers who are the colleagues that were actually at the forum. So they will be sharing the experiences that they have had on their topics. And we've got Chris White, Sabine Oberhuber, and Katharina. So that is what we will be talking about. If you can see on your left, I will be doing the welcome and some few introductions. And then Chris will tell us about the Global South Coalition. And then we've got materials as a service, and then just transition. And then there will be obviously discussions at the end, and people are encouraged to also ask their questions on the chat as we go along. Next slide, please, Christo. And just a bit about the African circular economy. We are a NPC registered in South Africa. And really, our focus is to share some important knowledge on circular economy with the African audience and people, beyond the continent. And we've got a representation in about 42 of the 54 African countries, and the membership is growing nicely. Next slide, Christo. And if we can look at key figures of what happened at the World Circular Economy this year held in Brussels, the World Circular Economy Forum was started back in 2017, and it is the initiative of the Finnish government together with Citra. And, we need to mention that in 2022, it was actually held in the African continent for the first time. The physical event was in Cape Town, and there were a couple of about 5 African studios across the continent. So if you can look at the participation of the continent in this event, you can see out of almost 9,000 people, participants who registered online and in person, the engagement or the numbers from the continent are not looking that good. And that shows that there is still some work that needs to be done when it comes to the circular economy in the continent. And I think that is why we are having this event to share what has happened. If you can look at the top 10 countries that attended, the most is still in Europe. So we need to look at the circular economy from the Global South perspective. And as I've said, that is why we are here. Next slide, please, Christo. And also, I think it would be expected, depending on the audience that was there, the limited mentions of Africa that took place in the forum itself. As you can see, the European Union is looking, a commission is looking at some investment towards this. And what was important is to see that the African Union Circular Economy Action Plan actually did come up. And we looked at some policies to say how are we moving forward, but again that is fairly limited, which means that we really need to roll our sleeves and do some more work in the continent when it comes to circular economy. And at this point, I am going to hand over to Chris. And Chris, if you can briefly introduce yourself before you get into your presentation, and then we'll do the same when you hand over to the next speaker. I will be in touch at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntobeko, and welcome to everyone online. We had over 70 registrations, so I'm hoping people are still going to filter in. We've got 18 people online at the moment, so fingers crossed. I'm hoping people aren't lost somewhere in cyberspace. Just to follow through before, first of all, I'm Chris White. I'm a director of the African Circular Economy Network, and been involved in circularity for more than 30 years. So I've kind of been around the block a few times. I just want to give a little bit more background also in terms of the World Circular Economy Forum, particularly with regards to ACEN. So the African Circular Economy Network has been directly linked with the World Circular Economy Forum since 2017. I know I was there for the 2017 one. I'm not sure if there's one in 2016, but certainly from the beginning. And what we've been trying to do constantly is bring forward the voice of Africa, make sure that we bring African perspectives through to the World Circular Economy Forum. So we've been very involved. I think it was in 2019 where we started negotiations with regards to looking at bringing the World Circular Economy Forum to Africa, which we successfully did, and ACEN co-hosted the World Circular Economy Forum in Rwanda in 2022 and hosted a number of studios around in 5 different countries across Africa for those who couldn't make it. So we're constantly bringing the voice of Africa into the World Circular Economy Forum. Even the World Circular Economy Forum 2024 in Brussels this year in April was no exception, although there was a lot more focus around European aspects with this year's event. Next year, it's going to be held in Brazil. I think it's Sao Paulo. So we will be there as well, flying the flag for Africa. But I think it's critical, even with those numbers that you see, the small numbers of people that Ntobeko alluded to, that were representative of Africa in the overall component, was, I think, purely a fact of that it was a real big focus on Europe this year. And I think we're going to be looking at a global South focus again next year. So ACEN is well linked. We have strong connections with the Finnish delegation, with Citra, and with a lot of our other European partners, particularly the Dutch and the Norwegian Circular Hotspot. So we've had a long history with the World Circular Economy Forum, and we are constantly trying to carry the flag for Africa. The first day of the 2024 event, which was held in Brussels in mid-April, it only started at about 11 o'clock in the morning. And before that, we had an event which we put together with the ACEN Foundation and in association with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to really welcome the delegates from Africa. And there were substantially quite a few people there, a lot of old faces that we remember. So it was great to actually be able to keep the track going for Africa. And what we did in terms of that also was just trying to give a little bit of a brief in terms of where we come from and where we're going to. But also we had inputs from the hosts, which was Enable, a Belgian organization, as well as the African Development Bank and the likes of the European Commission and DG INPA. So there's quite a lot of support that we're seeing right through the event from an African perspective. Next slide, please, Krista. Sorry, I got a bit of flu, so I'm a bit scratchy at the moment. So I'm going to be targeting 3 things. I was, as always, quite involved in too many things, but I got involved with specifically the circular food systems, the critical raw materials, and the Global South Coalition. And I'm going to give you a brief on each of those. So the Global South Coalition is something that we have been promoting for a couple of years. particularly with the leadership of Shalini from the International Council for Circular Economy in India. And she's done a sterling job in terms of continuing to promote this. What we want to try and look at here is just a kind of overview in terms of where this is, but effectively what it's all about is understanding that the perspectives of the Global South need to be heard. And the opportunities that we see from Latin America to Southeast Asia are very similar to what we experience in Africa. Thank you. So what we want to try and look at is understanding where we're going to go from here. And really, we're taking this forward in terms of saying we need practical outcomes. It's not just about the niceties of talking to our South partners and our partners from the North, but it's about trying to create an opportunity. Next slide. So we held a roundtable at the main event, and CITRA were very good in terms of accommodating us at the World Circular Economy Forum. And as always, we thank CITRA and our partnership with them in terms of trying to develop these things going forward. Excuse me. This is going to be fun. All right, so we looked at a number of different components, bringing people together, and we were quite amazed at the fact that we had 78 stakeholders in a room that was supposed to hold 50 people. So we were very pleased with the number of people that pitched up. And this, this represented a diverse group of people from industry, government, think tanks, academic institutions, multilateral development banks, government agencies, consultancies, etc. And along those delegates were representatives from entities such as the EU Commission, the World Bank, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs in India, and the Government of Finland. But really what we were pushing this towards was a discussion towards a proposal that we got a lot of support for, and that is the establishment of a Global South Center on the circular economy. Next slide. Excuse me. So part of that is that we're looking at the development of a Global South Center on circular economy. And this really is externalizing it from four main points. One is to develop pathways for sustainable development, looking at South-South cooperation as well as North-South cooperation, by advocating for low-carbon, climate-resilient, environmentally sustainable practices and an integrated and inclusive approach. The second is to bridge technical divides, looking at global. Honestly, I hate that term, but Shalini loves it, so we'll go with global, so global to local, or local to global. To address global challenges, looking at local approaches, thus fostering a greener and more sustainable future. Thank you. Thank you. Oh. The third was to inspire implementable policy actions. And how do we try and develop that? By promoting environmentally sustainable, integrated, holistic, and balanced growth through actionable policy recommendations. And then finally, to look at mitigation global business around climate risk and looking at management strategies for businesses operating across borders. Next slide, please. So the coalition really is looking at bringing advantage to the world, and it really is the focus around the Global South. We're going to be looking at developing pathways, low carbon pathways, climate resilient pathways, and looking at environmentally sustainable development to ensure that we have an inclusive approach for a sustainable future going forward. And again, how do we look at bridging the technical divide, understanding what is happening in the Global South and how we can bring that to the fore in South-South collaboration as well as North-South collaboration. And then really looking at addressing policy actions that we can both implement and enforce for environmentally sustainable and integrated and balanced growth. Excuse me. And finally, really to look at risk mitigation. Obviously, we're all very aware critically of the issues around climate change and the risks to climate change. And how do businesses, individuals, corporates, and governments address these particular issues? So where we're going in terms of the way forward really is to look at a virtual space and develop around that over the next year or so, and bring together the partnerships from Latin America and Southeast Asia, as well as then looking at direct funding applications for global centers. The first one ideally to be hosted in India, and essentially the focus there is to create a global center which can become a center where we can attract both opportunities for business and the private sector, looking at policy issues, bringing in research, looking at NGOs, understanding how we deal with the informal sector, and looking at technological approaches that allow us to unpack opportunities in the circular economy. So again, the idea is not for it to be completely related to anything around waste, specifically sort of packaging waste, but also to look at opportunities in terms of energy, water, agriculture, looking at the waste side of things, but then understanding things like infrastructure and alternative building products, etc. So as to bring together a whole host of components around circularity into a global center. And it's something that was designed and developed from a South African perspective. Some of you on the call may be aware of that. I can see a few of the names there. But I think that the opportunity in terms of driving this first and foremost for India is to look at the opportunity then to drive global financing, that we then end up with one of these centers, at least one of these centers in each of those regions within the next couple of years. The next slide, please. So critically, there was a lot of very important people in the room. And I think this really relates to the importance of the initiative. We had Pirjo Suomela Chaudhuri. She gave the keynote speech, and she's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland, a very great supporter of the initiatives that we're looking at. We had Mr. Ashok Kumar from the Embassy of India, and some very wise words from Peter Schmidt, who's he is the founding member of the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform, as well as an old friend and colleague, Mr. Freek van Eyck, who is with Holland Circular Hotspot and also co-chair of the EU CESP. And important people like Jane Feenan, who is with the European Investment Bank. We had some great interactions there, as well as Ankit Bhatt from Global Green Growth Initiative from Seoul. I think he's based in Seoul. And Philippe Garcia from the World Business WBCSD, World Business Council on Sustainable Development. And
that's right.
Thank you. Too many acronyms. And Mr. Andrea Leverani group, again, another big supporter. We're getting a lot of support from the World Bank group. So we're hoping to capitalize on the global support and see if we can take this thing forward. So the second thing that I was involved with was the circular food systems. Some of you may or may not be aware if you read our newsletters. ACEN is very involved with circular food systems, particularly the circular food systems for Rwanda, or the SURF project. And we had an accelerator on the 18th of April, really looking at addressing scaling circular food systems. And we held that with the SURF stakeholder group, as well as directly with the United Nations European Economic Commission for Europe, or UNECA, and their Circular Step program in Serbia. So it was actually quite fascinating seeing the linkages between the likes of these less developed European countries and Africa. And surprisingly, very similar issues that we're dealing with. Obviously, the climate's slightly different, but similar issues. So there you can see, for example, we had Annelies Witzhoff from IKEA Foundation, Dr. Susan Chomba from the World Resources Institute, and Dr. Janil Moldeleeva from UNECA. Next slide. So part of that was also looking at panel discussions. Again, a lot of the accelerators were not just about preaching to the converted. It was gathering information from people in the room. And there was a lot of very interesting perspectives from different components. We had two different panel sessions in this session, and we had Professor Shane Ward, who's very well known internationally in terms of his views around circular food systems and circular practices, as well as Eric Ruzigamanzi from Rwanda, myself, and Dr. Chomba, again from WRI in Kenya. So again, the focus is really trying to see, there's a lot of focus we're trying to put in as ACEN in terms of the opportunities around circular food systems. I've just returned from Nairobi, where we're promoting the expansion of this and the successes of this program into greater parts of East Africa. And again, trying to raise funding to look at taking these good lessons and expanding that into a greater region in the continent. Next slide. The final component that was focused on quite extensively at the World Circular Economy Forum was critical raw materials. And this is something that our other speaker, Sabine, will certainly touch on as well, particularly in terms of the circularity of that through materials as a service. But there was a lot of focus on that, and I think this is reflective of where we are globally, where we're looking at the kind of just transition and looking at how we go into renewables. And I think those of you in the room will understand that there's a lot of different things we need to look at in terms of renewables. Some of them aren't exactly circular. So there's a lot of mining that we need to extract materials to develop circularity. So there was 2 events on the first day, 1 on the second day, and the accelerators, there was 5 of them directly attributed to critical raw materials. And so I think this is a critical path, particularly for Africa, because of the fact that we are one of the main sources of that. So that was my input. Thank you for your time. Sorry about the scratchy throat, but I'm glad if I'll take any questions later, but I'll hand over now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And, quite a number of important points that you raised. And in the interest of time, we will not be going into them at this point and of the program. And now I am going to hand over to Sabine. And Sabine, briefly introduce yourself and take it away, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Sabine Oberhuber. I am the co-founder of Turn2, a Dutch company focusing on the transition to a circular economy. We were founded in 2010, so we have been around there for a while and developed a number of breakthrough innovations. So we started with Light as a Service, but also founded the Cadastre for Materials, a large online platform for material passports. And one of our thoughts was that we should think about concepts such as material as a service. And we were very lucky to gather a consortium of partners to work on that concept together with the African Circular Economy Network, but also Chatham House, and had Groene Brein, which is a network of scientists in the Netherlands. Am I sharing my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So I would want to. So I have now. I'm sharing. Yes. Okay. So, and I was asked by Mrs. Bonmar from the World African Circular Economy Alliance to come and join her presenting the concept of material as a service at an accelerator session on enhancing circularity in the African mining sector at the World Circular Economy Forum in Brussels. And I just want to walk you quickly through the concept of material as a service, as we already also did at the forum, and then share a couple of brief takeaways of the reception of that concept at the Circular Economy Forum. So what material as a service is about is that we have to address the current linear value chain, and to make sure that with what is actually at the moment a destruction chain rather than a value chain, because it ends with waste, will be turned around into a value sustain chain. And so a combination of materials flowing from somewhere, a mining site, to a couple of production steps towards an end product, and then actually flowing back, product being dismantled and in the end being recycled. But we found that from first experiments with product as a service models, which we thought in the beginning would be the solution to create a circular value chain, we found that we need to take it much more a global value chain approach, and that would mean that you would enforce circularity from the beginning of the chain, saying that materials should be used under the precondition that they can be reused in a later stage. And when you would grant that license of using materials throughout the value chain under the precondition that it can be reused, you would enforce circularity from the start of the value chain, as said. But if you would change that system then again into a system where the ownership of materials would remain at the place where materials have been mined, and in that case, it will be the global south. It will probably most very often be the case, it's African countries, retaining the ownership of those materials and giving them in a service, lending them out in the value chain, but receiving a remuneration for that material being lended out, would mean that we create a recurring stream of revenues to producer countries in the long term. That would mean that as long as the materials are in use in several production cycles, there would be flow of money going back to the countries where the material has come from, with a big advantage that you would not only create a potential for African countries to participate at the global value creation, which is created thanks to the products mined on their territory, but you would also bridge the gap between generations, because as we also discussed at the World Circular Economy Forum, the current demand for critical minerals, for raw materials, also in the light of the energy transition, is making that the depletion of raw materials is going ever faster on the African continent, with the risk that there will be, over a couple of generations, nothing left for people on the African continent. So creating a different model where ownership is retained of these materials is retained on the African continent would be a huge benefit also for future generations in Africa. So these were some of the benefits which were discussed and presented. It would such a model address the resource curse, because we could much better distribute rents also to local communities. The royal payments could fund socioeconomic development, and the future revenue streams, as said, would bridge also unjust systems for future generations. It would also be interesting for mineral importing countries, because it would address price volatility of materials, and be a potential to create win-win partnerships with producing countries. It would be for mining companies the potential to extend value extraction beyond mining activities. And last but not least, it would be a contribution to a transparent, accountable mineral resource governance for society at large. So we would advance circularity across global value change through a material as a service model. We are at the moment developing such an economic business model with the consortium I just mentioned. The problem we definitely have to address is how to avoid resource monopolies or even a new feudal system, saying that resource ownership is concentrated in a few hands and everybody else would have to lend the materials and be dependent on a couple of powerful players. So we need to establish governance structures to distribute the rents to local communities, and the traceability of material along the value chain is obviously also a challenge, which needs to be addressed, but which can be addressed in the light of developments such as blockchain, etc. So this is where the material as a service model has been discussed since 2022. It has been part of workshops or sessions at the World Circular Economy Forum. It was discussed for the first time in Kigali, then last year in Helsinki, and this year in Brussels. And in the intermediate time, we had also sessions at the World Resources Forum. So the interest is there. The reception at the session we had at the World Circular Economy Forum was, on the one hand, very positive. Certainly, as I said, in the light of this enormous demand for resources from the African continent for the global energy transition. And there was a clear concern raised as well that Africa has to make sure it has enough resources left for its own energy transition. And the concerns which were there were mainly around how to structure these contracts, how to make sure that we can track and trace where materials are going. And so it was definitely a model which was considered by the participants in the room. So thank you very much. This is my contribution from what has been discussed at the World Circular Economy Forum, and I would like to hand it over now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Sabina. I see Katharina is back. Over to you, Katharina.
Thanks, Ntobeko, and I think, Sabina, you have phrased this very nicely, because this leads now into the just transition topic, which obviously also speaks to mass. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Katharina Giering. I'm the Strategic Program and Operations Lead at ACEN. I'm going to speak in particular around the just transition today, but during the World Circular Economy Forum, I also focused on financing, because that's obviously a topic which is quite potent and becomes very important for enabling the transition. What we have seen is that this year was the first time that actually the just transition was mentioned in the World Circular Economy Forum. And ACEN has been involved in a Horizon 2020 funded project, which in particular looks at the just transition element for the last 2 years. So the topic is certainly not a new topic. We have actually pushed Citra and the team for quite a while to include this really, really important topic in the general program. And what I found very interesting is when the topic of just transition was mentioned, and I spoke to a few circular economy experts, that people didn't quite understand it yet, but also that they didn't understand the link to peace building and how a just transition needs to be designed into a circular economy transition. Otherwise, we're not creating those partnerships and actually build peace on a global scale. So just to give a bit of a background, the just transition is obviously not leaving any communities behind, especially at the moment we're focusing quite strongly on communities that live in mining areas or in areas where energy is being produced, and where we basically migrate away to more renewable, more green technologies. But the transition is not just a technical and an economic process. It's very much a profound and a comprehensive transition towards also changing or including the social factors in any kind of planning of interventions. If you want to go into the nitty-gritty, please read up a bit more about the just transition around procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. So those are the different elements that usually are considered. And what is really important is that a just transition is not just in a national context or is considered in a national context, but it's also very much linked to the international context and how do countries actually go into trade agreements, for example. We need to also be very careful that if we consider something as a circular economy model, that it doesn't just shift the burden into another global context, which we see a lot with secondhand clothing, but also electronic waste that ends up on the African continent. They're classified as secondhand goods, technically still usable, but in reality, they are not. So they're just being dumped. The just transition is not just about the energy sector. I think that has to be much more communicated and thought about, because we need all of the sectors to transition, and that requires also a just transition to it. Christo, I think you can go to the next slide. So the key outcomes of the Horizon 2020 Just to CE project is that currently the circular economy is obviously still very much focused on material use, but we can't grow infinitely in our economy. That's just not possible. So we do need to curb consumption somewhere, but that obviously has implication on the global north and the global south as well. In the global south, we still need to develop a lot. As I said, the circular economy, or the just aspect of the circular economy, is not just about labor. And I think here what we've seen in preliminary discussion is a lot about the number of new jobs that are being created. But just because you create a number of new jobs doesn't mean they are just. I think the waste pickers are quite a good example of showing that they technically have a circular job, but it's not a just job. We also need to consider gender and environmental justice in the equation if we want to design a holistic shift. And then what the research project found out as well is that the circular economy, and that is slowly but surely shifting, luckily, has mostly ignored the north-south relationships. So the global supply chains and the injustices that are embedded in those supply chains. Christy, you can go to the next slide. So while I mentioned there was a clean, you can go back to one of the slides. So at the World Circular Economy Forum, we had one plenary session about justice and how the just transition is important for the circular economy to build peace. We've also hosted a side event with EDCPM, which is a Dutch think tank, and they have basically developed a position paper that investigates how the Dutch circular economy transition can have an impact on a global scale, and look more at the negative impacts of it as well, which was commissioned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we do see that the thinking is kind of starting to kick off, but it's not clearly embedded yet. Luckily, we do have the Chatham House. They are currently designing a global circular economy roadmap, and they're very much looking at the inclusive element of a circular economy. And I think what I just want to mention as well is we have now the ISO standards around circular economy. They partially include the social aspect, but interestingly enough, the ISO standards are very expensive, meaning they're not accessible. So also I think within our circular economy bubble or in our ecosystem, we need to make resources accessible and make them understandable for the common person so that they can also actually apply and be integrated into the process. Krista, I think you can go to the next slide. Just some idea that I've put forward is, and this is not just to bash green hydrogen, it's just a case study, is green hydrogen is very much focused on in the African context at the moment as the energy transition carrier. With that though, with all the potential that comes with green hydrogen, we also need to consider the downsides and take that into account around that there's quite a bit of water that needs to be purified to a certain level is required. We need quite a lot of renewable energy resources to actually produce green hydrogen. And then if green hydrogen is not used locally, but actually exported to, for example, the global north, that's quite interested at that element, that we need to see how those infrastructures are built so that we don't create a lock-in and that we also don't have that negative impact on local communities that we've previously had. So I think I've just put green hydrogen as an example forward. And we need to constantly ask those critical questions is, what is the agenda? Who is actually owning it? Who uses it? And in which context is it actually being implemented? And I think that is taking the just transition into a nutshell forward. And then Christo, just the last slide is putting forward a graph. This is unfortunately very small, but we can share the links later on the graph, is really looking at the circular economy and then embedding the environmental justice, the gender and the labor aspects to it. And all of the resources are also freely available on our website and also the Just2CE website. So the conversations are happening, but they're happening quite slow. And then one last point to mention is that during the World Circular Economy Forum, we've also worked quite closely with the ACEN Foundation together. And we literally had a schedule in place so that at every session in the World Circular Economy Forum, an African voice is represented. So we're really trying to collaborate quite closely with all the different partners so that we can make sure that we capture all the knowledge, but also that we bring forward the African noise, the African voice. Yeah, and I think that's it. Obviously, this topic is much broader than 10 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Beko, but if you do have any questions or want insight of any of the materials, please reach out to us.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and thank you to all the esteemed speakers that we had today. Quite very interesting topics, and for me, you know, what is coming out is the future towards low carbon or decarbonization, the climate resilience, especially for the African continent. I mean, we see the disasters. How ready are we? And what is the link, you know, between low carbon and climate resilience, and also the just transitions and the materials that we are using, we are extracting, would using those materials as a service, you know, improve our resilience. And I see we are quite interactive already. There are a couple of questions on the chat and also a couple of comments, especially from Pietra. Pietra, I'd like to put you on a spot, if you don't mind, especially on your comments, the first one about the concerns that you have on using the concern on the African continent keeping enough materials for her own development, and also, you know, the last comment that you made on the chat, and I'm putting you on the spot because I believe in your work you do interact with the African Union. So if you can please take us through your comments and your thoughts.
Okay, Ntobeko, and hi everyone. Thank you so much. I did not expect, but okay, just to recap my comment is. Sabine said that someone in Brussels make a remark concerned that material as a service can further deplete African resources. And I find it a bit irrational if somebody say that, because actually what the current situation without material as a service is depleting resources so much. And by having it maybe more structured and keeping the ownership, you know, with the African communities is actually going to improve the situation. So just maybe Sabine, if you can reply to that. And my second comment was, I mean, just to support what Katrina said about the green hydrogen. We once at the European Environmental Bureau, we hosted a community from Congo, from around that big dam. I forgot now, where the green hydrogen will be produced. All of it really is for export to Europe, and that is very concerning. So it is happening. There is a huge appetite for green hydrogen in the global north, and I don't see that it will be ever used locally. So yeah, modern colonialism, I said, but maybe too controversial. So just this two. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pietra. I see Katarina is burning to comment. I will give you a chance, Katarina, and then what we are going to do is to go back to the questions that are already on the chat. And Michelle, I don't know whether you would like to ask your question or if we read it from the chat, but I think it's much better, you know, to have that interaction. Katarina?
Thanks, Ntobeko. I'll keep my answer very short. Piotr, to green hydrogen, it depends obviously on the country. Like Chile, for example, they have a very strong export drive, so nada is going to be used in their own country. If you look at South Africa, it's a bit of a hybrid model because Sasol is already producing 2% of the gray hydrogen that's used globally. So that's a local South African company. And they're trying to transition to green hydrogen. So it depends a bit always on the country if they use the hydrogen in the local context as well. But we do need to have those very critical conversations because obviously the infrastructure is very expensive, and we are talking about mega projects. It's not just easy projects to be implemented if we're talking about the amount of hydrogen it needs to be produced, especially green hydrogen. So I think there's a lot of nuances that can be unpacked within the green hydrogen discussion. But yeah, thanks so much for your comments.
Thank you, Katarina. Sabine, I see your hand. Michelle, I see also Chris has seen your question and he has committed to answer later. In the interest of time, if you don't mind, I will hand over to Chris to maybe read your question and then answer. Chris?
I'm trying to find it quickly. Okay, so Michelle was talking about the fact that there might be a bit of overlap in terms of the opportunity around the Global South Initiative. I think we're very critically aware of the requirement not to duplicate. If you look at Africa alone, we have initiatives that are being run like the African Circular Economy Alliance. We have the GACERA, which was also put together a couple of years ago. But we're also seeing initiatives internationally with the likes of Chatham House and other global players like the ECESP, who are looking at these initiatives. So it's critically important for us to focus on the Global South. So yes, we have to be aware of duplication, but it really is to look at what are the lessons we can learn. What can we teach India? What can India learn from us? What can we take to South America or vice versa? How do we work with the ACEN circular economy stakeholder platform to look at solutions that work there under similar socioeconomic conditions that we can apply into Africa? And that's really the focus of the Global South Initiative, understanding that if you look at these statistics, and this is why the North is nervous, is that South-South trade has increased to 60-40% share versus 20 years ago, it was 40-60. So the swing is moving to South-South trade. And I think that has the Global North nervous, particularly around resources. And I think that we need to ensure that we're not beholden to linear lock-in on Northern partners, that there's an opportunity for a South-South coalition that drives trade and opportunity in developing countries.
Thank you so much, Chris. Sabine, in your comment, if you can also touch on Pietra's question about differentiating between the recycling loops and the reuse loops of the products that contain materials as a service. If I can read that question for you.
Yes, that would be great.
Yes, he's asking, do you differentiate between recycling loops and reuse loops of the products that contain materials as a service?
Okay, thank you. I think just I think both of my comments are to Piotr. One is that you said that material as a service, or I would phrase it a different way. We see material as a service as a means to make sure that Africa can hold on to its resources via an ownership model. So Africa would build what is now a mine underground, build a mine on the ground in forms of materials being deployed in products. So that is one maybe clarification to your comment. Secondly, there would be probably a differentiation in the revenue streams coming back to the place where the material comes from, because if you have a material which is sort of all the way up functioning in a product, the chain of revenue will be longer. While if the product is coming back and is in a state of being reprocessed as a product or as a component, for that point in time, the sort of value creation of that material is a little bit lower, but at this, it will be a continuous revenue stream from that one material to the source where it came from. So you would have, yes, a fund which is collecting all those revenues from the value creation of that material. Is that more clear?
Yes, thank you, Sabine. Thank you. Yeah. Thank
Yes,
you.
he's been showing a sharp hand to say he is happy. There is also another question for you, Sabine, and it is from I am getting lost on the. It is from Lina. Lina wants to know, how would these materials as a service model take into account challenges of traceability of the materials? And I think you did touch on it, that it's one of the things that we are looking at. So maybe if you can directly answer to that question.
Yes, that is exactly what we're looking at the moment. I mean, there are a lot of initiatives looking into for example, product passports where materials are being logged. We co-founded something like the materials cadastre or the land registry for materials. I think blockchain will definitely be a part of the solution, but this is clearly something where a lot of research needs to go into in order to make this a viable model. And I think you can probably start also with sort of batches of materials, which where contracts are being made, and stewardship has to be taken for these batches of products before you really go and be able to track and trace every molecule along the whole value chain.
Thank you very much. Christo, can you just confirm if I've covered all the questions on the chat, or have I missed something?
I think we've covered most of them. Thanks, Mbeko.
And I see Suzanne is online, and you know, I know how passionate she is about materials as a service, and I see she made a comment. And Suzanne, would you like to share that with us?
Well, just that comment, we talk about it, and it seems like a theme emerging here that, you know, I don't want to be mean now, and I hope there's no Dutch people that feel like offended. But, you know, if I see here incinerators in Nigeria, you know, claiming large parts of South Africa's natural spaces to produce the hydrogen, perhaps they're not, after all, so friendly. I think we need to be very cautious. Perhaps we are also need to guard against a new form of colonization that's just a bit more friendly, but, you know, still has the same purpose. And, you know, there were so many studies coming from Europe, you know, looking at the CE potential in Africa, and I just smell the red in terms of saying all they do is snooping around and seeing where is the stuff that they can take. And sorry, that was just me being undiluted. But I think we need to guard against it, and we need to perhaps really be aware of it. And at some stage also bring it on the table and say what's going on, you know. And sure, we receive perhaps then some funding for a few projects, but, you know, is this basically to pacify us or to not go against us? I mean, you know, that's certainly not right either.
Thank you, Suzanne. I see, Katharina, your hand is up. Before I hand over to you, maybe if you can add this on your comment. I've made a note that one of the things that you look at the WCEF was financing. And you spoke about just transition. And I think at least in South Africa, there is quite a discussion around the financing of the just transition for the country and who finances it. If you can touch on that in your comment as well.
Thanks, Ntobeko. I think just to dilute Suzanne's answer a little bit, it's a lot of countries that have interests in all the different African countries. It's not just the Dutch. I do appreciate, though, that the Dutch are actually one of the first countries that actually looked at the just transition and how they negatively could impact other countries by implementing a circular economy themselves. So they're very aware that even if they are circular, it doesn't help if the rest of the global south or the global north is being left behind. Obviously, we always will have those trade interests. And I think it's also from a departmental governmental structure, how do governments take the just circular economy forward within their entire structure on how they frame trade agreements and how they set up the government. So it's really changing structural processes, because usually then circular economy sits within a small department, right? And those people are usually passionate about it, but it doesn't trickle through the entire organization. So I think that's something that we need to be cautious about also in the countries we are active in. And then tobacco in South Africa, a lot comes from Germany, what we see, from France as well, from the Netherlands as well around JET, but also from International Development Agency. But there needs to be much more money raised, obviously, to completely transition the very coal-intensive energy sector in South Africa into a renewable, more green energy sector. So that will be quite a challenge, because again, the just transition there is really important, but it's not just the energy transition. We are also looking at the manufacturing sector and the agriculture sector that needs to transition. Sorry, yes, this is my roommate's cat. He also wants to be part of the webinar. I couldn't get him off my lap, guys. So I think it's in each of the countries we always, and I think that's why it's so important to ask those critical questions. It's great if countries want to invest on the African continent, but it's also understanding what are the trade agendas of each of the countries. And I think we need to be very, very careful,
Yes.
and have those very critical discussions and push a little bit back as well, because I do think there's always a bit of a narrative. Help needs to come from outside. And I think that needs to be a bit better implemented in Africa.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Katarina,
thank
for mellowing down my rather strong comments. Absolutely right. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much. And you know, out of respect for time, everyone's time, unfortunately, we will have to close this very interesting and very interactive session. And I think we can continue to interact. Thank you very much to everyone who participated, and the organizers and the speakers. I would like to ask Christo maybe to just share about how can we continue with these discussions through our platforms. We've got Secular South Africa, we've got LinkedIn, we've got the website of ACEN, where, you know, from the knowledge sharing point of view, we can continuously engage. On that note, thank you very much, everyone. Christo?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ntobeko. So just a quick one from my side. In the chat, you guys will see I shared some links to our website and our social media platforms where you can interact and we can continue the discussion. And then just also as a side note, we will send out the recording and a few notes to everyone that registered as well, because a lot of our colleagues could not attend the actual meeting. So we will send that out, and with all our other links and platforms as well for you guys to join. Thank you very much for everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Mm.